Story 1. He cut an absolutely ludicrous figure even by his standards. I have been watching Donald Trump rallies for nearly 10 years, and I can honestly say this was probably the most unhinged spectacle he has ever delivered. His dentures were whistling. He made bizarre noises, and very little of what he said made sense. Beneath the ridiculousness, there was also dark talk about an intention to deploy the military against Americans he does not like. I wonder how many people in that room had ever actually seen the real person, as opposed to the heavily sanitized media caricature. By the end, they had. Story 2. I hear the generals are calling them fat man and little boy because they bombed so heavily. Story 3. One of 10,000 reasons he should be immediately removed from office and imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. He openly declared war on American citizens. He is a traitor and a danger to this country and the rest of the world. Story 4. He is doing a huge public service by showing everybody exactly what malignant narcissism looks like. Story 5. I'm reminded of Michael Che saying, "Are we sure it's okay to be making fun of this guy?" Story 6. Hegseth said, "We also don't fight with stupid rules of engagement. We untie the hands of our warfighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country. You kill people and break things for a living. You are not politically correct and do not necessarily belong in polite society." That is an absolutely unhinged position, especially when combined with President Trump saying he was supposed to root out the enemy within and mentioning using American cities as training grounds. This effectively denies the existence of war crimes and advocates unleashing the military against civilians labeled as enemies. It promotes the idea that warfighters should kill without mercy and do not belong in society. Why the media is focusing on the grooming comments is beyond me. Story 7. It seems he gathered the brass to read the room. He wants the military to consider using United States cities as training grounds. He peppered his remarks with the phrase "the enemy within." Is he setting the stage to call off elections? Story 8. After the hedgehog called the generals fat slobs, he introduced someone who vomited stupidity and incompetence to accentuate the hedgehog's hate and malice. Just perfect. Story 9. I loved it. I've never seen anything that has done more to convince me the military would not be willing to back a Trump coup against America than what Trump forced them to endure yesterday after making many of them leave much more important things behind to fly halfway around the world. There was not a single officer in that room who seemed to be thinking, "Please tell us again how fat and incompetent we are." Story 10. He is a bloviating piece of shit. How can a fat draft dodger talk tough to real military leaders? It is ridiculous. Why more Americans do not see through his garbage is beyond me. Story 11. It was too embarrassing to watch. When my dad was that incoherent, he was already in assisted living, and he was still a much better person. Not a rambling windbag spewing insults, grievances, lies, and self-aggrandizing nonsense. He was just confused. So even dementia is not an excuse for behaving like Trump. Story 12. In normal times, this would be enough to invoke the 25th Amendment. This shows the true weakness of the Republican Party. Story 13. These are two dangerous highlights of Trump's speech that confirm he should be removed. 1. He walked in expecting cheering. When he received silence, he immediately threatened generals, admirals, and senior enlisted personnel with loss of their jobs and ranks, laughing as he did so, if they did not like what he said. 2. He tried to compel the military to use blue cities as training grounds and to attack American civilians he dislikes, whom he called the enemy within. Story 14. I'm so glad I did not have to sit and watch that in silence. Talk about torture. Story 15. It was horrendous. I wasn't expecting anything different from this idiot, but he sounded more demented than usual. He actually believed the generals would whoop, holler, and applaud him, as if he were at one of his rallies. When they didn't, I felt hopeful. He is stark raving mad. Story 16. He wants to be a feared dictator so badly. He is a pathetic excuse for a human being. Story 17. Complaining about Biden's mental health while staying silent about Trump's shows how tribal this country has become and how hypocritical people are. Story 18. He is a sick old man. America has never been as weak as it is today. Story 19. I am Canadian. The 51st state talk in front of the United States military brass is not helping me believe they would not invade us if ordered. Story 20. Homie works for Putin. Let us kick out half the soldiers because of their pronouns and shaving preferences, send the remaining soldiers to United States cities to pick up garbage and shoot civilians, replace our stealth warships with antiquated battleships from World War II because bullets are cheaper than missiles, encourage our highest-ranking generals to resign because they are fat, and pull women out of combat positions for political reasons even though the military is desperately understaffed. It is as if Putin wrote all this and gave it to Trump on a napkin. Then Trump had to ask someone to read it to him because he is an illiterate child molester with dementia who soils himself 5 times a day. Story 21. His performance at the United Nations was every bit as pathetic. Had he not loaded his cabinet with sycophants and loyalists, we might have some hope in the 25th Amendment. They are all bending the knee, so we know that is not going to happen. He has been compared to Hitler, but if you look at history, he is more like Franco. These are dire times when the president tells the military that their hometowns and cities are going to be the training grounds for war. Story 22. People spend too much time microanalyzing everything this fucking psychopath does. It doesn't matter how sickly or disease-ridden he becomes. They will never declare him unfit for office, however clearly unfit he is, because he is useful to the oligarchs who benefit from his policy decisions. Stop wasting your time deconstructing his speech patterns and farming karma on Reddit. Story 23. It made Biden's last debate performance look like the Gettysburg Address. Story 24. I am more concerned about the many small unrecorded meetings involving the generals and the staff of President Trump. Story 25. A clown and draft dodger preaching to those who have actually served is essentially an embarrassing imbecile talking down to people who earned their stripes. Story 26. It is sad that we, as Americans, must watch this disgrace of a man play childish games on the world stage. It really felt like he was trying to demonstrate his strength and that he should be followed. Leaders do not need to prove through words that they should be followed. Both those who voted and those who refused to vote have let us down. We the people have neglected our civic duties and are now reaping the consequences of our failings. Story 27. He'll see it as a triumph, an epic speech that got the generals all pumped up for the future. Anyone who isn't in the cult will see it for what it was. A rambling, pointless shambles. Story 28. The words did not bother me as much as the way they were delivered. It is one thing for a commander to speak with authority. It is another to tell the brass, if you do not like it, the door is right there, and do not forget to leave your career on the coat rack on your way out. That is not leadership. That is a hostage situation. Then came the part about turning cities into training grounds and waging some kind of war from within. Take the military, the institution that is supposed to stay out of domestic politics, and hand it a paintbrush to paint inside the Constitution's red lines. Civil-military boundaries exist for a reason. Usually that reason is to prevent situations like this. Story 29. You know it is bad when even the usual Russian bots do not come into the thread to defend him. Story 30. I know my opinion is influenced by my strong distaste for the Cheeto clown, but how can anyone watch him and not think he is seriously unwell and unbalanced? Story 31. The looks on their faces said, "You moron. We swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. Not your sorry peach ass. 90% of what you said is probably illegal, and we are required to disobey unlawful orders. If you had not dodged the draft, you would know that." Story 32. As a former United States Army officer, I have seen a few of these time-wasting come-to-Jesus moments in my day. It is usually a narcissist who outranks everyone else and wants his ego stroked. If either Trump or Hegseth wanted to improve readiness, unannounced visits to troops would be a better choice. Send the memo, then verify the soldiers received the message with an unannounced visit. It works every time. Story 33. I recently went through the last year of my father-in-law's life. He had dementia, cancer, and kidney problems. He was 93. The president seems to be presenting symptoms similar to those my father-in-law showed late in his life. I do not know President Trump's medical metrics, and I am not a doctor. To my untrained eye, I see the same things my father-in-law experienced. Story 34. He appears senile. It is frustrating that the press is not more directly addressing this, but much like Fetterman, it is clear he had some kind of stroke or similar event a few weeks ago. At every public appearance since then, he has been barely coherent. Politically, I fear his administration and abhor what he stands for, but politics aside, there is a major issue. He is clearly a compromised and declining older man. Story 35. He called Americans animals and said we are at war. Not sure why people are not freaking out a little more. Story 36. My mother was a nurse on a palliative care unit for terminally ill patients, and after watching Donald Trump's speech, she believes he has congestive heart failure. He sounds and speaks the same way her patients who had that illness did. She believes he will probably not live to see the midterm elections. Story 37. I am in the military, and I immediately thought, oh my God, those generals are going to look at each other afterward and think, what did we just listen to? I think what he did was disrespectful. He literally announced where every general in the United States military would be and when. If you are going to be carelessly risky, at least make it matter. If you are going to take me away from my family, at least make it important. These generals deserve more than being used for a publicity stunt. It was a huge slap in the face to have that meeting and then, a day later, have the entire military report to work without pay. Honestly, only some of the changes made were okay, but they need revision. Also, who writes their speeches? They come across as narcissistic and insulting. I realize some are like that in real life, but why not try to hide it? They seem proud of it. You should speak to members of the United States military with respect, not call them names like fatso or use other insults. If you want respect, give it first. Story 38. Appalling. Between his and Hegseth's speeches, all I could think was that now we are the baddies. That was some villainous behavior. I cannot believe this is where we are or imagine where we are headed. Story 39. 1. Why aren't more people talking about that droopy, half-closed right eye? 2. He has very low energy and speaks in a mush-mouthed monotone. He used to get excited talking about how he came up with ideas like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. He would throw in a few war stories about big, strong men crying at his decision, then include a reference to Crooked Hillary and make that sucking noise with his teeth. Now, it seems he feels obligated to ramble. He just blathers on about frontage without any real excitement. He is like an elderly pet whose owners have been debating whether it is time. He ambles into the room droopy, sad, and low energy, soils everything, and they sigh and reach for the phone to call the vet and schedule the appointment. Story 40. I'm sure all the generals were pleased to be hectored by a major and a draft dodger. Story 41. It was probably good to show the top brass and Fox News viewers how stark raving mad Trump is up close, along with his sidekick Kegsbreath doing his dance so they can act accordingly. Story 42. It's very telling what his fans are cheering for when that is the quality of speech he gives. The man rambled for 5 minutes about how good he is at doing stairs. It was like they had yanked an elderly person out of a care home and put them on stage. Huge embarrassment, and really frightening that this person and that loser Kegbreath are calling the shots. The things Kegbreath said were much more consequential and alarming than the ramblings of a senile old man. He said they would allow drill sergeants to put their hands on recruits, and he insinuated eliminating rules of engagement. Story 43. Trump declared Democrats to be the enemy within once again, then told a room full of the top United States generals to invade cities in the United States to fight and kill those Democrats. If someone thinks it meant anything else, they are delusional. Story 44. I think Trump might feel like the walls are closing in around him. Story 45. What a joke he is. What an insult to the men and women in that room who had to endure his nonsensical, incoherent ramblings. A room full of some of the best leaders in our military had to listen to that clown. It is a travesty. Story 46. It was unbecoming of the President of the United States to suggest that American cities are military targets. Sickening to think people want to normalize this. Story 47. I have little doubt there is plenty of support for the President and the Secretary, despite apparent attempts to suggest otherwise. Reading the overview from Stars and Stripes, it is portrayed as cautiously as possible. Even with that editorial care, the subtext makes it clear that, For the amount of actual content, it could have been a video conference or an emailed flyer. To pull a flag officer from the other side of the world, let alone multiple officers, on short notice for a 20-hour flight to attend an auditorium rally right before a government shutdown that will reduce staffing and support, delay payments, and follow the previous record-setting government shutdown from the first term of the current administration is a mood killer, to say the least. Story 48. The utter lack of applause or recognition of him as a true commander-in-chief should give all Americans pause to wonder how low an opinion our military leaders must have of Mr. Trump. There were many extremely smart, accomplished people in the room who worked hard for everything they earned, and all they do is lead people. In terms of leadership skills, they outranked Private Trump by many bars, stripes, and stars. If they had stood and turned their backs, the repudiation could not have been louder. Trump relished the idea of using his complete immunity and power to try to humiliate those people because in that setting no one could talk back or challenge him. Every general in that room read that as complete cowardice. They were not at all intimidated by the bumbling buffoons. Trump left the room knowing he had lost the military if he tried to give illegal orders. Story 49. I believe any veteran who supports Donald Trump is a disgrace, and any citizen who supports him while claiming to be a patriot is a moron. Story 50. If you think about it, the generals in that room have served under more presidents than Trump has. They've seen the good ones and the bad ones. I have to believe they know. Story 51. It is humiliating to see those morons on stage. The notion of Pete Hegseth believing his advice to an actual general gives me shivers. I am embarrassed for the military leaders who had to sit through that cringeworthy display. I cannot tell whether, as a once proud American, I am more humiliated or more angry at the mockery the administration is making of America in the eyes of the world. I understand that they revel in having no shame, but anyone who knows America's history should feel shame. That is all Hegseth and Trump conveyed at their invitation only Make America Great Again rally. Story 52. I have been telling my husband for months that Hegseth wants to get black men and women out of the military, citing the beard rule for black men. I hate being right, guys. For those who do not know the shave rule, I was in the Navy. Black men have very curly beards and they get a lot of ingrown hairs, so many of my friends had no shaved chits or only short-term shaved chits. Hegseth gives them a year of shaved chits for a problem that is lifelong. That will eliminate black men who are smart, loyal, and patriotic. He also removes women from combat roles and eliminates the office that protects women's rights. He talked about strengthening our military when he just crippled it. Diversity is a strength, not a weakness. Story 53. Donald Trump walked into Quantico on Tuesday expecting a rally. He got a funeral. The generals sat in perfect silence, faces locked in the kind of grim stillness that comes from years of watching idiots talk and choosing not to react. Trump, of course, couldn't handle. I've never walked into a room so silent before, he confessed, his voice trembling somewhere between wounded pride and panic. Then came the kicker. If you want to applaud, you applaud. This wasn't leadership. This was a washed-up Vegas act begging the crowd to clap. The commander-in-chief turned into the clapper-in-chief, reduced to prodding the nation's top brass like a sad carnival barker who forgot his punchline, a campaign rally in uniform. Instead of a strategy, Trump delivered his usual medley of grievances. Barack Obama ruined everything, Joe Biden ruined it twice as hard, and only Donald J. Trump, self-proclaimed two-term, maybe three-term president, could save America. It was less a military briefing than an episode of The Apprentice, Pentagon edition. The generals, trained to withstand battlefield chaos, sat stone-faced through the barrage of nonsense. They have endured artillery fire with more enthusiasm. Enter Pete Hegseth, America's pastor-in-arms. Trump's Secretary of War took the podium with the intensity of a man who thinks Tom Clancy novels are actual military doctrine. He promised fire and brimstone, called for purges of fat generals, and announced he wants the next war to look exactly like the Gulf War, because apparently it's still 1991 and cable news network is running that same grainy footage of tanks in the desert. But Hegseth wasn't done. He led them in prayer. Yes, prayer. The nation's top generals, summoned by presidential ego, were folded into a forced altar call like extras at a megachurch revival. The separation of church and state, obliterated. Constitution, shredded. Jesus apparently is now commander-in-chief. Trump can play vice weakness on parade. Trump likes to brag about firing generals who aren't warriors. But on Tuesday, the real firing squad was silence. Not one clap, not one cheer, just the steady hum of contempt vibrating off the brass like feedback from a dead microphone. These men and women have seen actual combat. They've buried soldiers. They've lived with the weight of real command. And now they're expected to cheer for a man who brags about moving a submarine or two like it's a toy in a bathtub, or who lectures about 2 nuclear weapons as though nuclear strategy were a stand-up routine. No wonder they didn't clap. The pin drop presidency. What happened at Quantico wasn't just awkward. It was diagnostic. Trump's presidency is a hollow shell propped up by applause. And when the applause disappears, so does he. And Hegseth? He's the zealot-in-chief delivering sermons about war and Christ in equal measure, a man confusing the Book of Revelation with the Pentagon's operations manual. Together, they make quite the duo. One desperate for claps, the other desperate for amens. The generals gave them neither. Instead, they gave silence, the most cutting judgment of all. By Deborah Cross. Story 54. I think he acted exactly as a narcissistic, racist octogenarian in at least the early stages of dementia, while in a position of extreme power and surrounded by sycophants would be expected to act. Story 55. It sounds like he is preparing the military leadership for orders to fire on American citizens. Story 56. Aside from the illegal and dangerous suggestion that we would train soldiers to wage war in San Francisco and other blue cities, Trump largely gave the same speech he always does, a stump speech. Story 57. Absolute fucking clown. If I were a general, I would be pissed at the commander-in-chief for acting like a child, saying, "If you don't like what I say, resign." Story 58. He seemed out of breath and was slurring his words. He sounded like someone at the point where his family should intervene and consider alternative living arrangements or in-home care, because he is unlikely to be able to care for himself in the near future. He sounded worse than he did just last week at the United Nations. Someone said his eye was half closed. I will have to check that. What he said was pure fascism. Fascism centers on identifying an external enemy and an internal enemy. I read an article that said the only difference from his usual rants was advocating the use of the military in cities. Story 59. Say what you want, but I am starting to think that, strictly speaking, this Donald Trump fellow is not on the level. Story 60. He put his tough guy act to the test with real tough guys. It went exactly as you would expect. Story 61. Weak. It's the same tired nonsense he has been saying. Insane people coming into the United States from asylums, sleepy Joe Biden, and rambling about people. He makes generic statements anyone can make. It is surprising no one presses him for details. Can you name one insane asylum that has illegal migrants entering the United States? 26 minutes between speakers because of microphone problems. The same incompetence repeatedly. They cannot do anything right. It is pathetic. We are extremely lucky this party is so ignorant and incompetent, because if they were competent they could lead America down the path of the Nazis and cause serious damage. As long as we remove these clowns in 3 years, we will be fine. Story 62. Looks like those newsreels of 1930s Germany, except in color. Story 63. He is in extremely poor physical health and is in rapid mental decline. Will Vance be able to keep the Make America Great Again movement together? Story 64. This meeting could and, from a national security perspective, should have been an email. But Trump and Hegsworth wanted to stroke their own egos by being on stage. Trump, in particular, would relish the role of Generalissimo and El Presidente for life, complete with a chest full of unearned medals. Story 65. As a retired Marine officer, I know for a fact that no one is impressed with Trump, Vance, and Hegseth. Maybe young enlisted personnel like their low-class approach to governing, but the officer corps is not impressed with how they are running things. These generals have dedicated their entire lives to protecting the United States Constitution, so they understand what is at stake. Fortunately, they are professionals who will follow all lawful orders, but they will not become what the overweight orange baby wants. Unfortunately, at this point the military is our last line of defense against a corrupt and fascist takeover of the government. Let's pray that they can hold the line. Story 66. The speech signals an intent to purge the military of non-believers and bend it to his will. Given how lackluster the institutional pushback against Donald Trump has been so far in his second term, for example tech bro sycophancy, and the substantial increase in funding for United States immigration and customs enforcement, with $75 billion allocated over the next 4 years, it is not looking good for United States democracy. Story 67. Maybe it's a good thing that all the military leaders realize that Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are the worst kind of wackos. Story 68. This regime should have been drummed out months ago. They are antithetical to this country. Story 69. It looks like a salesman trying to sell garbage to people who aren't buying it. Because the people at their rallies are naive, they mistakenly assumed the audience was as well. Story 70. There is a well-known video in which Saddam Hussein did something similar in Iraq. By the end of it, he was seen as a dictator. Everyone recognized his cruelty during that meeting. I think Donald Trump wanted a similar outcome here, but in typical Trump fashion, he completely messed it up and ended up appearing foolish and weak. Story 71. A case study in pathological narcissism that will be in future psychology textbooks. Amidst all the breathless speculation that it would be a loyalty purge, a declaration of war, or a major policy shift, I figured they just wanted to rant to a captive audience to feel big. They did it because they could. Story 72. I will be happy when he is incapable of opening his mouth ever again, however it happens. Story 73. Why is no military general calling for the invocation of the 25th Amendment? They all heard it. What on earth are people thinking? Story 74. Was he addressing the suckers or the losers? The guy is an embarrassment. Story 75. A tired, bloated, burnt orange grandfather making idle threats to a silent captive audience. Story 76. He is being held together by a cocktail of pills and seems loopier than usual. It reminds me of my father-in-law when he was dying. It is sad, as he will never face any meaningful justice for his actions. Story 77. In his head, he imagined himself as Hitler rallying fascist troops. In reality, they stood silently because they were required to be there. It was cringeworthy. When he told them they could applaud him, it revealed how much his ego was hurting. Story 78. If only he had been prosecuted for accepting bribes for pardons years ago, among other violations of virtually every aspect of his first administration, we would not be here. As for his speech, it was the most anti-American and potentially illegal compendium of authoritarian declarations in our history. Story 79. All military leaders were in one room to see the problem firsthand, and they can now discuss what to do if asked to commit treason. The majority do not want to enable a dictator. Story 80. It was an interesting idea to gather all the generals and anger them. That's one way to start a military coup. Story 81. When people are not automatically cheering every time he pauses, it shows how pathetic what he is saying is. Story 82. It's odd. Whiskey Pete blamed the troops for being out of shape. Then his far-off boss came jingling in. Story 83. Imagine being told by your boss to fly across the world for a huge meeting that turned out to be a 1-hour pep rally led by the worst manager in the history of the military, whose mother had to beg the chief executive officer to give him the job. Meanwhile, the chief executive officer, whom no one likes and who has never worked a day in his life, rants about woke and declares war on fellow citizens. Story 84. I desperately hope it was a wake-up call to the generals in the room that we are in a very dark place in our history. Story 85. Commander-in-Chief Bone Spurs, the draft dodger, and his drunk little buddy endangered everyone by assembling them in one room. They should have pulled a coup right there and then. Story 86. I am just grateful that my father, a career member of the United States Navy, was no longer alive to witness this. Story 87. Pretty sure he was coming off an amphetamine high like his role model Adolf Hitler. Trump and Hegseth want to turn the top brass into the Schutzstaffel. His whole regime fashions itself after infamous dictators, past and present, and I can't wait to get them out of the White House and into the big house where they belong. Fuck Trump, Nazis, and the Third Reich. Story 88. It's pretty amazing to watch a fat draft dodger tell a room full of people who dedicated their lives to their country that they are overweight and should train their troops against Americans. Story 89. I think the military should start taking its oath to defend the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic, very seriously. Story 90. It went very badly. He was nervous speaking in front of those flag officers. Story 91. I think his days are numbered as president, and probably as a human being on this planet. Story 92. There is nothing wrong with his speech that the 25th Amendment would not fix. Story 93. Fuck that guy. What I got was, I don't need you. I have the National Guard. Then, to follow that up with the false bravado of a Fox News commentator acting tough, the entire world is laughing at us and has been since last November. Wake up. Story 94. I am a United States veteran. It was disgusting, horrifying, disturbing, enraging, cringeworthy, and treasonous. Story 95. Being told you are fat and lazy by an obese draft dodger. What a world. Story 96. He looked like a powerhouse, putting meaningful pauses between his statements so the generals who were not that smart could really absorb what he was saying, as thoroughly as Depends absorbs Cheeto-colored urine when someone soils themselves. Just kidding. That fool is a moron. Everyone knows it except Make America Great Again supporters, who keep saying such a strong man while others laugh at them behind their backs and their only excuse is blaming Sleepy Joe. Story 97. What Trump's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said was, Trump is now the most dangerous person to this country, a fascist to the core. I will add that what Milley said is nothing new. Story 98. President Obama and President Biden both meet Little Kegseth's parameters for a fit military. The current commander-in-chief does not. Story 99. The media needs to stop acting like any of this is normal. Story 100. Telling the generals that there would be no more fat slobs, only to have a fat slob come on stage immediately afterward, was a chef's kiss. Story 101. He seemed sleepy and was struggling to stay awake. I am not trying to be funny. Story 102. The military could easily take out the Trump regime. Do the job that Merrick Garland would not do. We need a hero. Right now, it is all villains. Story 103. After 2 hours of crazy town, I hope we have moved a little closer to a military coup. Story 104. He seemed weak, tired, demented, and pathetic. His voice was soft and very incoherent. He does not project strength. He is instead a feeble old man clearly undergoing cognitive and physical decline, which, in all likelihood, is progressing faster than anyone realizes. Story 105. This is illegal. Our armed forces do not operate within the United States. Story 106. What a shame it is that envy, bigotry, greed, and ignorance contributed to the election of a complete buffoon to the highest office in the United States. Story 107. I only see negative comments. Where are his supporters? He must have millions of supporters, since he was elected president of your country. Story 108. Trump is nothing. He is not the power. Stop allowing yourself to be distracted. Given that, based on the totality of the actions of this administration and all three branches of government, which are ostensibly captured and operated outright by private interests such as the Heritage Foundation, the Constitution is dead, null, and void. Thus we revoke our consent. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Story 109. The man is an idiot. I hope more members of the military recognize he is a failure and stop supporting him. Story 110. He is an embarrassment to the United States of America and every other country on earth. What is really crazy is his supporters eat this shit up. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.